turn on your kitchen tap and the water will not make you sick. You never think about it. But the thing that made that water safe was not a law, and it was not a public vote, and no crowd marched to demand it. In the autumn of 1908, in Jersey City, New Jersey, one physician quietly began adding a disinfectant to the drinking water of about 200,000 people, without their permission and without telling them. When the secret surfaced, he did not deny it. He walked into a courtroom and defended it under oath. A man does not do something that reckless without a reason, and the reason was the water itself. For most of American history, the glass on your table was a gamble, and the odds were not good. In the growing cities of the 1800s, the same rivers that gave a town its drinking water were also the drains it emptied its filth into. A city would pump its supply out of the river on one bank, and a few hundred yards downstream it would pour its raw sewage back in. What one town flushed away in the morning became what the next town down the current drank by nightfall. Nobody designed it that way on purpose. It was simply what happened when hundreds of thousands of people crowded onto a riverbank faster than anyone knew how to handle their waste. And the water carried a passenger. Typhoid fever rode those currents from house to house, a bacterial infection that lived in human waste and spread through contaminated water. In American cities, it was a fixed feature of the calendar, flaring up every summer and every autumn, filling the fever wards, emptying the schoolhouses. A healthy adult might survive it after weeks of burning fever and wasting sickness. The very young often did not. Typhoid, and the broader family of waterborne diarrheal diseases that traveled beside it, fell hardest on infants and small children, the people least able to fight it off. In tenement districts, an outbreak could move through a block of families like a tide going out, and the smallest coffins were always the ones that told the story. Put a number on it, and the ordinary horror comes into focus. In Jersey City, as late as 1905, the death rate from waterborne disease ran at roughly 20 for every 100,000 people. That was a typical year, the background hum of a city that drew its water from a river and hoped. Jersey City was not unusual in that. Across the country, this was the accepted cost of urban life, a slow and steady toll that people had simply come to accept, the way you learn to live beside a railway line. The water looked clean, clear in the glass, and still it kept killing children. Now, Americans were not stupid about this, and they were not idle. By the early 1900s, a few cities had tried to break the cycle, and their attempts are worth walking through, because they show you exactly how hard the problem was and why the half measures were not enough. The first serious American attempt came out of Lawrence, Massachusetts. Lawrence was a mill town on the Merrimack River, and like every mill town, it drank from the same river it fouled. In the winter of 1890 and 1891, a typhoid epidemic tore through Lawrence and the neighboring city of Lowell and killed more than 200 people. That kind of loss forces a response. Massachusetts had already set up something well ahead of its time a few years earlier. In 1887, a research facility on the riverbank called the Lawrence Experiment Station, where scientists studied what was actually in the water and what could be done about it. Out of that work came a solution borrowed and refined from Europe: slow sand filtration. The idea was elegant and gentle. You build a vast bed of fine sand, and you let the river water trickle down through it slowly, over hours. The sand itself does some of the work by trapping particles, but the real magic happens in a living film that grows across the top of the bed, a thin biological mat of microorganisms that consume and strain out the bacteria as the water passes. Lawrence put a slow sand filter into service in 1893, and with it Lawrence became the first city in the United States to filter its drinking water specifically to prevent disease. The filtered water was cleaner, the fever wards grew quieter. It worked, but it did not work all the way, and it did not work every day. Sources differ on exactly how much the typhoid rate fell, so be wary of anyone who hands you a precise figure. What is not in dispute is the limitation built into the method. A slow sand filter is a living thing, and living things are fussy. In deep cold, the biological film slows down and the bed can freeze. In a flood, when the river surges filthy and fast, the water can push through faster than the sand can clean it, or bypass the beds entirely. Filtration reduced the danger. It did not remove it a few times a year. In exactly the conditions when the river was at its worst, the shield could fail. And a shield that fails on your worst days is not really a shield. The second American attempt was not about cleaning the water at all. It was about moving the problem somewhere else, and it belongs to Chicago. Chicago had a peculiar geography and a peculiar horror. The city drank from Lake Michigan, an enormous clean freshwater source, and it dumped its sewage into the Chicago River, which flowed into that same lake. Every heavy rain flushed the city's waste toward its own drinking intake. So Chicago did something audacious. It reversed a river. Through a staggering feat of engineering, the sanitary and ship canal, the city permanently turned the Chicago River around by 1900, so that instead of carrying sewage out into Lake Michigan, it carried that sewage away from the lake and down toward the Illinois River and, eventually, the Mississippi. For Chicago, it helped. The city's own typhoid rate improved once its filth was flowing away from its own faucet. But the reversal accomplished something uglier than it looked. It did not destroy the sewage, and it did not clean it. What it did was pick the sewage up and send it downstream onto the towns and cities that sat along the rivers below. Their drinking water, their sickbeds, their children, those communities were not grateful, and they said so loudly in the newspapers and eventually in the courts. Chicago had not solved the problem. Chicago had exported it. On a river, everyone lives downstream from someone. By the middle of the first decade of the 1900s, American engineers understood the shape of the real answer. If you could put something into the water that actually killed the bacteria, reliably, cheaply, every day, cold or flood, you would end the cycle for good. Everyone knew that. The obstacle was the public, because the chemistry that would kill the bacteria was exactly what people would never allow, because to the ordinary person, the proposal sounded like madness. You want to put a chemical into my drinking water, on purpose. The public reaction to that idea went well past skepticism all the way to terror. Newspapers thundered against the notion of poisoning the public supply, and they used exactly that word, poison. When some cities tried to add alum, a harmless clarifying agent that helps particles clump together and settle out so the water looks clearer, crowds turned out to protest even that. There is a chant that survives from the era from people who did not want their water treated with anything at all. We don't want puckered water. They would rather drink the river as it came, dirt and all, than let an official drop something unfamiliar into it. You can understand the fear. These were people who had watched patent medicines poison their neighbors, who had no reason to trust a distant authority tinkering with the one substance they could not live without. There was no established science they could consult, no federal agency to vouch for a dose, no century of safe practice to point to. There was only the word of an expert, against a lifetime of instinct that said you do not put strange chemicals in the well. And so a hard political fact locked into place. No American city, anywhere, could have won public consent to add a disinfectant to its water. Not by vote, not by ordinance, not by persuasion. The moment you asked the public, the answer was no, which meant the only way it could ever happen was to not ask. That is the man we need to meet now. His name was John Leal. Born in 1858, a New Jersey physician who had spent his career close to the ugly end of this problem. Leal served as the health officer for the city of Paterson, which meant he was the man called when disease broke out in the crowded streets and mill housing. He had walked into homes struck by scarlet fever and diphtheria, and he had used a substance called chloride of lime, a powder we would now recognize as a cousin of common bleach, to disinfect those houses and stop the spread. He knew what the chemical could do to germs on a doorknob or a bedsheet. There was family history in the work as well, because he was the son of a Civil War Army physician, a man who had served with a New York regiment, so the trade of medicine and the weight of death were in his blood before John ever picked it up. And Leal had done something more unusual than most physicians of his day. Since the late 1890s, he had been experimenting on his own with the chemistry of killing waterborne bacteria. He tinkered with electrolytic salt solutions and with chlorine in the laboratory, and out of that patient work he arrived at a conviction that almost no one shared. He became certain that chlorine, in an amount so tiny it seems impossible, a mere fraction of a single part per million, was enough to kill the bacteria that carried typhoid. Not enough to taste, not enough to harm, just enough to make the water lethal to the germ and harmless to the child. Everything he would later stake his reputation on rested on that razor-thin margin. He could believe in a weapon he could not see because, for the first time in human history, the invisible enemy had a name. This was the age just after germ theory finally won the argument, when the great German physician Robert Koch had isolated the cholera bacterium in 1883 and proven, beyond serious doubt, that specific microscopic organisms caused specific diseases. Leal was not gambling on a hunch. He was applying a new and hard-won science to the deadliest problem his cities faced. The enemy had a name at last, and he knew what killed it. All he lacked was a reason the law would let him act, and that reason was about to arrive in the form of a lawsuit about money. Here is where the story turns on a single phrase, two old-fashioned words written into a business contract: pure and wholesome. Jersey City needed more water, and around the turn of the century it contracted with a private company, the Jersey City Water Supply Company, to build it a new supply. The company dammed the Rockaway River out in the New Jersey Highlands and created a large new reservoir called Boonton, and it ran the water many miles east through a pipeline to the city. Water first flowed to Jersey City from that project in 1904. Then the two sides fell out, and the fight was about money. The city looked at the steep price and decided it did not want to pay in full, and it reached for a legal argument to justify holding back. The contract had promised the city water that was, in the language of the day, pure and wholesome. Using the new bacterial testing methods that Koch's science had made possible, the city's experts argued that the water was nothing of the kind. So it went to trial in the Chancery Court of New Jersey, a court of equity that handled exactly these kinds of disputes. The first trial was long, roughly 40 days of testimony spread across the calendar, before a judge titled Vice Chancellor Frederick W. Stevens, with dozens of witnesses and thousands of pages of argument about what was living in the water. And when Stevens finally issued his opinion in the spring of 1908, he handed down a finding that would force the water company into an impossible, historic choice. He largely agreed the company deserved its money, but he also found that the water was not always pure and wholesome, because 2 or 3 times a year, especially after heavy storms, high bacterial counts short-circuited the reservoir's natural settling, and dangerous water reached the city. Next came the order that started the clock. Stevens directed the company either to build an expensive system of sewers across the entire watershed above the reservoir to keep the contamination out, or, in a phrase that would echo through the next century of public health, to devise other plans or devices to purify the water, and he gave them a deadline of roughly 90 days to do it. That phrase, other plans or devices, was a door left ajar, and Leal, who advised the company, saw straight through it. He also believed the sewer plan was close to useless. The bacteria that spiked the water on the bad days did not come only from a pipe you could intercept. It came washing off the whole living watershed, off the soil, off the roads, off manured farm fields, flushed downhill by the very storms that caused the danger. You could build sewers for years and still never catch the runoff that mattered. The fix belonged in the water itself, not out in the watershed. And the court had just, without quite realizing it, given him permission to try. If you find these origin stories worth your time, consider subscribing. There is a longer and stranger history behind the everyday things than most of us are ever taught, and we take apart one piece of it each week. A determined man moves fast when the law finally opens a door and slams a clock down beside it. On the 19th of June, 1908, Leal took the ferry across the Hudson from New Jersey to Manhattan, walked into an office on Broadway, and hired the finest sanitary engineer in the country. His name was George Warren Fuller, and he was the man who had already built the first modern filtration plant of its kind in the United States over at Little Falls, New Jersey, a chemical feed system that dosed treatment into millions of gallons a day. Leal needed Fuller's genius for feeding a precise, tiny, constant amount of a chemical into a vast moving river of water. The deal was struck, by every account, on little more than a handshake. Then Leal delivered the bad news. Fuller had to design and build a working chlorination plant for an entire city in the sliver of time the court had left them. He did it in 99 days. Fuller adapted his chemical feed design to a new purpose, engineering a system that would dissolve chloride of lime, the same powder disinfectant Leal had used in fever-struck homes, and drip it into the water as it left Boonton Reservoir on its way to the city. With Fuller's associate George Johnson running the operation day to day, the dose was startlingly small. Roughly a fifth to a third of a part per million, mixed into a flow of about 40 million gallons every day. And on September 26, 1908, the plant went live. There was no press release, no public meeting, no sign posted at the reservoir, and no letter to a single household. No permission was asked of any government body because none would have been given, and none was sought. In one stroke, on the strength of one physician's conviction and one engineer's design, the tap water in a city of 200,000 became, without a soul knowing, the safest large supply in America. It was an act of extraordinary nerve and extraordinary exposure. If Leal was wrong about the dose, if his razor-thin margin was off, he had just chemically dosed a city of strangers, including their infants, on his own private judgment. There was no board to share the blame, no statute to hide behind. He had bet 200,000 lives, and his own name, on chemistry that the public would have called poison. And for a few weeks, only a handful of men knew what was happening at all. It could not stay quiet, and Leal never intended it to. The whole point was to prove the thing in the open, and the venue was already waiting, because the court case was not over. The company still had to go back before the court and show that its other plans or devices actually satisfied the decree, that the water it now delivered truly was pure and wholesome. So a second proceeding opened, beginning in the last days of September 1908, this time before a special master named William J. Maggie, whose job was to examine the company's solution and report on whether it worked. And that turned the hearing into something far larger than a fight over a water bill. In that courtroom, the practice of chlorinating a public water supply was, in effect, itself put on trial. The opposition was not foolish, and it was not fringe. Some of the most respected sanitary scientists in America testified against the chemical approach, insisting that the honest, proper answer was to build the sewers and remove the filth at its source, not to dose the finished water with a disinfectant and call the problem solved. They worried the chemical did nothing about the dirt and organic matter still in the water. They worried about the long-term effect on the people drinking it. These were serious people making a serious case, and Leal had to answer them not with bluster but with evidence, sample after sample, showing that his tiny dose of chlorine had driven the dangerous bacteria out of the water almost entirely. This was the moment the whole thing turned on, the moment a scientist stops hiding behind his data and stakes his own body on it. Leal was asked in that courtroom whether the water was truly safe. He answered that he drank it himself. He said he would give it without a moment's hesitation to his own wife and to his own children, and he told the court he believed it was the safest water in the world. That was not a lawyer's phrase, it was a father's. And it landed because Maggie, after weighing the science on both sides, found in favor of the water. He reported that Leal's device was capable of rendering the water delivered to Jersey City pure and wholesome, and that it was effective in removing from it the dangerous germs the earlier decree had feared. It was the first time a court anywhere had examined the routine chemical disinfection of a public water supply and pronounced it good. Here's the part of the story that hardly anyone tells, and it may be the most generous act in the whole affair. John Leal had in his hands the most valuable idea in the history of public water. He could have patented chlorination. He could have licensed it, city by city, and grown enormously rich, as every waterworks in the country came, eventually, to need it. But he did no such thing. He deliberately left the method free, unpatented, unencumbered by any license or fee, open for any water company anywhere to copy without paying him a cent. And the cost was comic in its smallness. Treating the water ran about 14 cents for every 1,000,000 gallons, a little over $5 a day to guard the whole city, which meant there was no reason on earth for another town not to copy it. And that decision is precisely why the idea did not sit locked in a New Jersey vault, but spread across the country and the world within just a few years. When Leal and Fuller stood up at the meeting of the American Waterworks Association in 1909 and laid out their results and their costs, they were handing the blueprint to everyone in the room and telling them to take it. They took it. Chlorination spread from town to town with a speed almost nothing in public health had ever matched. By 1914, only 6 years after that secret plant hummed to life at Boonton, more than half of all Americans served by public water systems, 53% of them, were drinking chlorinated water, and the dying stopped. In Jersey City itself, the waterborne death rate that had run around 20 per 100,000 in 1905 fell to low single digits within a dozen years, all but vanishing by 1920. Nationally, typhoid, that fixed feature of the American calendar, collapsed. In the smallest coffins, the infants who had always paid the steepest price for a dirty river stopped filling. Historians of medicine will tell you that the simple act of putting a trace of chlorine into drinking water has saved more human lives than very nearly any measure ever devised. It began with a man who refused to own it. But the word in the title deserves a correction, because what actually happened is more surprising than the myth. This was the moment America's water became safe. It was not, however, the moment America got a clean water law. What happened in 1908 was a private company's engineering decision, blessed by a state chancery court in a dispute about a contract. No legislature voted. No public agency required it. The safe tap did not begin as a right written into law. It began as a technology, adopted because it worked and because it was free, and legitimized by a judge examining a business deal. The law came limping along behind, and it took a very long time to catch up. The first federal drinking water standards in America arrived in 1914 when the Young Public Health Service set bacterial limits on drinking water. But those first federal rules legally bound only the water served aboard interstate carriers, the trains and the ships that cross state lines. They did not govern the water in your kitchen. The federal government had no authority over your city's supply at all. Those standards were revised in 1925 and again in 1946 and again in 1962, and even that last version reached only 28 substances and still bound only interstate carriers as a matter of federal law. Not until the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 did the federal government, acting through the newly created Environmental Protection Agency, finally gain real authority over the nation's public water systems. That is more than 60 years after Leal. A child born the year that secret plant went live could have been a grandparent before the federal law arrived. Today, the agency sets limits for more than 90 contaminants, and the system that guards your glass finally rests on real legal ground. But get the order right. It was a technology first, a court ruling second, and an actual national law a lifetime later. And the story does not end in triumph, because the fix is neither total nor permanent, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. The whole apparatus works only where it is funded and watched and maintained. And when the watching lapses, the 19th century comes straight back. You saw it in Flint, Michigan in 2014 and 2015, where a change in water source and a failure of oversight let the same lead the Romans once plumbed their pipes with leach out of aging service lines and into the taps of families, poisoning children in an American city 100 years after Leal. The engineering that protects you is not a monument, it is a discipline, and a discipline can be neglected. And beyond your own borders for much of the world, that deadly 19th century condition never truly ended. The World Health Organization estimates that on the order of 360,000 children under the age of 5 still die every year from diarrheal disease tied to unsafe water and poor sanitation. That exact enemy Leal cornered in a New Jersey courtroom is still, at this hour, taking the youngest lives, wherever the technology he gave away for free has not yet reached or cannot be maintained. The problem, in other words, was solved. It was simply never solved everywhere, and it stays solved only where someone keeps the plant running. The next time you fill a glass at the sink and drink it without a second thought, hold that ordinary moment up to the light. That safety did not come from a grand law or a public vote or a hero riding in with a banner. It came from a quiet physician who understood an invisible enemy, who took an impossible deadline and a court's careless phrase and turned them into a secret experiment on 200,000 of his neighbors, who drank it himself to prove it, and who then refused to own the thing that would save the world. The water in your glass is clear. The history in it is anything but. And it is worth remembering, every time, how strange and how fragile the ordinary really is.